Hello everyone, and welcome to this third in the BAR's digital event series on digital teaching in Romantic Studies. It's really nice to see so many of you here on a cold night in December at the end of a long semester, and a particularly long semester due to the current circumstances. Welcome on behalf of the BAR's Digital Events Committee. I am Matthew Sangster, so I'm the BAR's website editor and I'm one of the members of the committee. The committee is headed by Anna Mercer and contains Colette Davis and Amanda Davis and our fantastic BAR's Digital Events fellow Francesca Kelleran, who's done an amazing job organising all of the actual technical infrastructure for the events. So we'd really like to note our thanks to her for doing that. We have had an event on perspectives in Romanticism. We've had an event on digital editions in Romanticism, and this is the last of a series of 3 events programmed by the committee. We were very glad to open up a call because we really want this event to be driven by the interests of BAR's members rather than be dictated from top down by the interests of the BAR's committee. So you'll have seen that in the past week or so, we've announced a whole series of events running from January to July next year, covering a whole range of topics from Burns Night to museums to engaging with non-white perspectives on Romanticism to Romanticism and transness. There's an amazing list of events which are available on the BAR's blog and available for booking now through Eventbrite, driven really by the suggestions that we've had by our members. So I encourage you to look at those. But in this sort of initial run of events, we were really trying to think about where we are in this strange moment where so much of what we're doing has become digital and attenuated in various ways. And so we wanted the event on perspectives to sort of think about where we are in 2020. We thought an event on digital editions would be useful because so many more of us are using digital editions and digital resources necessarily in our teaching at the moment. We also thought it would be nice to have an event on teaching Romanticism and teaching Romanticism at this particular moment, and to invite a range of scholars to address that topic. So we have 4 amazing speakers today. I will just say a few brief words about them at the beginning, and then we will have the 4 presentations, and then we will have time for questions. We'll take all the questions after all 4 presentations, but if you have questions while we're going, please feel free to type those in the chat. You can put a Q at the beginning of them. That's good for us being able to pull them out, and then we can begin addressing those questions a bit later on in the event. And you can either type a question and we can ask it in text, or we can ask you to unmute and join the conversation and speak to our fabulous panelists at that point. So I will just say a couple of words about each of our panelists. So the first speaker tonight will be Emma Butcher, who is currently at Edge Hill University, where BAR's 2022 will take place. She's taught at a whole range of places, including Manchester Metropolitan University and Lincoln. She did a PhD at Hull. She was a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Leicester. She's also a BBC New Generation thinker, so someone who's thought really deeply about communicating research and ideas more broadly. Her first book, Brontes War, came out this year. Our second speaker will be Dan Cook, who is at the University of Dundee, and I believe is head of his department for his sins, which must be a particularly difficult job at the moment. We invited Dan, who is also on the BAR's executive and has been for some considerable time, in large part because he's curated a major series of resources on teaching Romanticism, the Teaching Romanticism series for Romantic Textuality. He also runs the Copley Bursary scheme for BAR's and is being disgustingly productive at the moment. He's just published his book Reading Swift's Poetry, Cambridge University Press, and is about to publish a book on Walter Scott's short fiction with Edinburgh University Press. Following Dan, we'll have Stephen Gregg from Bath Spa University, who's one of the really early adopters of the digital possibilities opened up by increasing accessibility of online collections. Thought a lot about digital editions and databases, both in his research and in his teaching. He has a book coming out, I think, very soon on the history of Echo from Cambridge University Press, 18th century collections online, and he'll be talking to us about teaching book history at this particular moment. And last but by no means least, we have Jo Taylor, who is in an explicitly digital position as a Digital Humanities Presidential Fellow at the University of Manchester. Prior to that, she worked on a big digital mapping project at Lancaster, and a lot of her research engages with space and place and poetry and maps, and she'll be reflecting a bit on how that works in this moment where space and place have been strangely warped by digitality of various kinds. So a really exciting range of speakers. We will take them in alphabetical order. That seems the most democratic thing to do. So I will disappear from your screens now. I will invite Emma to unmute and to talk to us.
Oh, hey, so hopefully you can see me and everything. I can't see myself on the screen, so I'm going to assume that you can hear me and that you can see me. So this is great. So I think it's quite kind of, I suppose it's quite not natural is the wrong word. I've been teaching all day, so my brain is fried. So probably I feel like in a good position to be starting this panel because I'm not really a digital humanities expert. I don't use a lot of kind of digital history, or hadn't done before we started to do online teaching in my research. So I feel like I've been muddling through this term and learning things as I go, which probably is maybe the same for quite a lot of people in this position who's finally kind of had to be exposed to the realm of online teaching. So I feel like these are my personal experience, my broad overview of things that have worked for me or things that I found really useful in my teaching. So at Edge Hill, I've actually taken over from Andy McKinn's teaching and syllabus. So I can't be applauded for designing a syllabus, but it's a wonderful romantic series filled with unexpected romantics and introducing students to the first time to women romantics, to not the kind of canonical romantics or just the canonical romantics. So I can't have any points for designing the course, but I've certainly tried to kind of add my take on it. So first up, teaching online, and these are some of the points that I muse upon and have encountered within my teaching online, is just some general points here. And the first thing which I've really enjoyed about it, I've actually really enjoyed teaching online this term. I've found that the students' different voices have come out in different ways, and I've really enjoyed seeing them blossom in many different respects. Some have their cameras on, some just have their mics on, but also students gain confidence a lot using the chat feature. I don't know whether this is something we can talk about in the questions, but I've really enjoyed just stepping back for a little bit, having a couple of minutes where I put my video off, put my camera off, asking a really quite, I suppose, large open question, and just seeing the chat start to come in and seeing people engaging with each other in the chat feature. And this is what I think are the benefits of online teaching, is that students gain confidence speaking in different ways. The other thing which I found is really interesting, and something which I think that students really respond to, is relating romanticism to modern life. And I'll come back a little bit with that, with some archival tools that I use. But certainly just to get the conversations going, if I'm myself and I think of something where, I don't know, something which I found a little bit romantic, or something that I've seen in terms of cultural, societal, thinking about bringing in news stories as well. So one of the great things about the Wollstonecraft statue, and that being in the media and in the news and on Twitter, is bringing up romanticism up to modern day, which I think my students have really enjoyed. We've also noticed the benefits of guest lectures and Q&As, and we've done this a lot within our teaching this year, and it's worked really well. Like we're doing these kind of events now, we've organised these great events where romantics, well, Andy has mainly organised them, but I take credit for also doing some stuff, where speakers come and they actually deliver a lecture in pre-recorded form. So this goes up on the VLE, it goes up on our online learning system. It also goes up on YouTube as well to an open public audience. So the class connects somewhat with the public, and we use that amalgamation of that in a Q&A session, which is then opened up to the public, where it's a mixture of teaching, but also a public engagement event. So it works on multiple levels, and also gives the students opportunities to engage with what the public think, etc., etc. So we found that that's worked really, really well. Also, online presentations in Romanticism this year, which is a second year module, it's the first time that a lot of students have maybe done a presentation like this, or learned how to do a presentation. And we've learned what the flexibility of that is like online. So, for example, we do live presentations like I'm doing now, like we're all doing in this panel. Some students have chosen that, to share their screen, to present live, and then take questions from the chat, or from kind of a digital hands up, or anything kind of in that vicinity. But also It's been really useful for students who maybe feel a little bit anxious about doing it live, who have problems with presenting, that there's been options for them to pre-record their presentations and for them to be played in class, either using Zoom, so like we're doing now, and recording it like we do our lectures perhaps, or through PowerPoint, where actually there's a little soundbite that you can use on each screen to talk over your presentation. So it's given lots of flexibility, and again, has shown how students can adapt and work well in different ways. And the last thing, digital tools have been my friend, and we're going to come on to that in various ways, but there's been some upsides in being able to have students with a laptop on hand at kind of every moment of the seminar. So before class, this is what I like to do. At Edge Hill at the moment, we've realised the benefit of recording lectures in blocks and how well the students respond to that. So rather than just doing a 50-minute lecture straight out, we can put it into sections and put it into manageable, digestible sections, which students really like. It means that they find it easily digestible. It also gives you a break as well to collect your thoughts in between. Maybe at the end of each block, you can ask a question, which you can revisit in the seminar. It also gives the opportunity for multiple staff to do different sections as well. So we've really enjoyed doing that. Equally, I've known the value of podcasts and quizzes, and I'm sure these are things that you've linked before when doing kind of before class prep, but certainly being able to reflect on those, play certain parts again within seminars has been really interesting. Clear, direct instructions about reading, and I know this is something that we have to do anyway in seminars, but I've noticed that with digital online learning, there's a lot more anxiety in the students about reading. So using those clear, direct instructions have actually been and making sure that they're up on the online learning environment, making sure that they're easily accessible far in advance has been such a benefit to students because they feel a little bit anxious about online learning. So it's been great to kind of ease them in. Also, digital learning has also given rise to all of these great digital events like what we're doing now, like what Babs are doing now, like so many places are doing now, including university specific events. And it's been great for students because it's accessible. It's accessible for everybody. It's been accessible for us. I know that I've got a lot out of this time, just being able to attend an event here and then skip off and go to another event. But linking these online events to students means that students are becoming much more engaged with our research and who we are as academics. And linking those to the VLE before class or after class or any other time has just been really beneficial, as well as hosting our own Q&A sessions. Archival links have been great, so putting those up in advance, but more on that soon. And the one tool that I absolutely love, and so do my students, is Padlet. And I'm very happy to, if anyone wants to send an email about how to use this or how to embed Padlets within your Blackboard, I'm very happy to answer any questions. But it also gives a great springboard for the beginning of a seminar. So this is an example, and I asked my Romanticism class permission for this, that I used before a romantic session where we were thinking about nature more generally, thinking about Romanticism and the natural world. And I was just thinking also about how we were connecting nature to childhood, which is what I was going to begin the session with. And I just wrote the question, what reminds you of childhood? And it gives a personal understanding before the class begins. And you can see here lots of lovely responses, like the idea of a relaxed Sunday or going on camping holidays and being in my grandparents' garden with helping kind of pick garden features and all these kind of idealized lovely memories that my students had. And this was a great opening segment for the seminar to think about the legacies of Romanticism today, bringing that up to date and thinking about our personal connections with Romanticism and maybe what that means individually to each of us. So that was really great. Then it's about kickstarting discussions. And the one thing which I find really interesting to do at the beginning of a seminar is bring in an object that's interesting or curious. and I give the students time to really engage with that object, to zoom in on it, to try and do their own research, to kind of play detective on it. So this is something which I used in relation to the Napoleonic Wars. So it's something which I work on, which is the Brontes and the Napoleonic Wars. So it was something research led, but also they could see that it had Charlotte Bronte written on the scrap of paper. They started to try and look at what kind of object it was, why someone's kept seemingly a piece of wood. And it just became a really great conversation starter. And it's actually a piece of Napoleon's coffin that was given to Charlotte Bronte by Monsieur Heger when she lived in Brussels during the 1840s. And it started this conversation going of the legacies of the the Napoleonic Wars into the 19th century. It started students kind of talking amongst one another, being interested in archival sources. So that was also a really interesting way that I found starting discussions, finding something that you're really interested in and showing that enthusiasm to the students and letting them kind of take the reins a little bit and play detective, make them interested and curious in what the subject is. The other thing that's been also brilliant, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about this a lot, is creating context using archives. So these are just a list of some of the great archives that I've used in my classroom, in my virtual classroom. Also, I mean, Dan's going to talk about teaching romanticism, so romantic textuality, so I'll leave that. But generally, just the range of materials that you can access that students can have live in front of them. You put a link in the chat as well as before the seminar, and you get them to engage with them. I think the Blake archive was probably the one that my students really enjoyed the most, just because of the biography mixed in with just the different images, which were just a collection of all of Blake's engravings and other kind of ephemera. And they just loved being able to scroll through these, to zoom in on them, to magnify them, to make them kind of to actually give them an opportunity to be researchers, to be scholars. And this is the same with things like the British Library. We looked at the Drury Lane theatre bills in the British Library and the British Museum. We've looked at various European exhibitions, which has been great for Erasmus students. We have a couple of German students in our class at the moment who are really interested in German Romanticism. So it's allowed them to feel included in the context of traditionally what we teach, which is British Romanticism, and thinking about sources that they can use in their research as well. So that's been really interesting, and I found that really, really useful. And finally, just some activities that I found really interesting and really useful online. Obviously, the encouraging chat conversations, I've talked about that, but a lot of students I know, if you use small breakout groups, they really enjoy turning their mic on in the small breakout groups, and maybe when you come back into the big room they'll turn their mics off again. But I've really enjoyed kind of hearing smaller conversations still. I feel like I can still get that personal connection with students through digital teaching. We also had a great session on Wollstonecraft a couple of weeks ago now, and it was just after the Wollstonecraft statue debate had been going on. And it was through being able to be online and adapt my seminar quite quickly that students were able to go away. They were finding news articles, they were engaging with Twitter, they were engaging with social media, they were even looking on TikTok at reactions to this statue. And then we did an open debate where half the class were in a breakout group and half the other class were in another, and we were talking and creating a debate on either side about this Wollstonecraft statue. So it's been able to be more adaptable in terms of that kind of thing. I've talked about presentations with open discussion and about the pre-recording, researching activities that we can do that live. We can go to archival materials live. Another thing which has been really great is the response between not only the lecture in terms of a guest lecture in the Q&A, but also having that opportunity in class to write questions for the Q&A with the public. So it's engaging students in the broader public, but also giving them an opportunity to actually prep questions which may form assessment questions, which may get them thinking about the other way round, some student-led learning, which has been really great. And also linking art to literature as well. So I've talked a bit about archival things, but it's also given a great opportunity for me to link art to literature and have students really engaging with art and the context of Romanticism more generally. And also just quirky activities as well. So for our Hazlitt week, we actually created our own poison pen portrait, which was up on Padlet beforehand, so they could do it beforehand, but also during class as well. So it's given a lot of vary and a lot of it's given us a lot of fun and free rein to do a lot of different things. I know this has been a very broad overview of my personal experiences, but I hope it's helped some way in introducing how digital learning and digital teaching can be fun and can be adapted to everybody who's kind of muddling through this strange time. So thank you very much for Baz for having me come and speak today.
Thanks so much for that, Emma. And I think, yeah, it was a really wonderful account of the sort of what you've been able to do digitally and sort of taking into account the limitations, but also the possibilities. I've also noticed that thing where if you would be in a seminar and a student might sit very shyly and be unsure about inserting themselves into an entirely spoken conversation, but some of those shyer students have come out through the chat function, sort of felt more able to sort of edge their way into the conversation with text, having better time to shape their thoughts and then to post things. So and the breakout rooms also, I agree, those have been really nice, a lot easier sometimes than moving a whole lot of furniture around in what can sometimes be quite a cramped seminar space. So we'll pick up on a whole series of the issues that you raised there, I think, in the questions as we move forward. But let's take our second presentation now. So our second presenter is the inimitable Dan Cook. So, excellent background, Dan.
Me and my friend. Quick sound check. Can you guys hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up or an hallelujah? Thumbs up. Great to see. It's great to see everyone. Thank you so much for joining us all over the world. It's always so exciting to welcome friends and colleagues all around the world, united in our love of Romanticism. I want to pick up on some things that Emma said beautifully in her talk, and I want to follow in the same vein if I can. I want to be perhaps even more anecdotal. I just think that was a great start from Emma, and some new things for me. Padlet, that's brand new. I don't know what that is. That sounds really exciting, and I think my experiences dovetail quite nicely with what Emma was saying. So I want to follow in that vein. I want to speak explicitly about one thing, which is collaboration. That's going to be the key word for me today. Collaboration as it currently is, collaboration as it might have been if it wasn't for pandemic, collaboration as it could still be post-pandemic. I want to speak quite anecdotally, but also I want to be quite speculative. I want to pose some questions and some things for us to think about, some what-ifs and wherefores and the like. I'm talking about collaboration in quite a low-tech way. I think some of the challenges my own students face, and I think many students perhaps face, is this sense of what we might call digital poverty, not having access to materials, but more immediately not having great Wi-Fi connection and so on. And in a strange way, we teach online almost exclusively at Dundee. In a strange way, it's got me thinking about alternative teaching practices that I want to talk about, which involves visiting places, following in the footsteps of major authors. And my background alludes to one of our most famous and most celebrated former residents in Dundee, which was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, later Mary Shelley. And in fact, I'm going to share in the chat bar right now. I'm not using any presentation materials, but I'll put some links into the chat bar. One of my main partners in putting together some teaching materials for the study of Romanticism is a comic studio, which is on the doorstep of my office, not the office I'm currently in, my home office, my work office, which I have had no access to for many, many months. In a weird way, the collaboration with them has been facilitated by the move online, because they've got deadlines and they tend to work quite digitally anyway. Having them close to me, I could pop into the actual building It didn't really lead anywhere, but now, working remotely on various things, we've been working with them on the Being Human Festival of the Humanities for a number of years now, and the link takes you to some comics that we've produced as part of that. It includes 2 Frankenstein comics. There's a Gulliver's Travels comic. Gulliver's Travels is my main text. And there's H.G. Wells and so on. And these are free materials to use. And there's also another resource that we've put together with this team. So this is a digital collaboration, but something that we also use in our teaching is we produced our own edition of Frankenstein, which includes images produced by some of Scotland's leading comics artists, living and otherwise. We appropriated some of their ideas. So I want to talk about collaboration in a variety of ways. Collaboration within departments, and what I'm quite keen to get a sense of is from you is to what extent do you feel that you're part of a romanticism team, or do you kind of feel, as often I do, that I'm sort of the lone romanticist in my department? And in many ways, I'm really an 18th centuryist, a long 18th centuryist who has always loved and will continue to love and publish in romanticism. But my research profile is very much as a Swift scholar, as an 18th centurist. And we're facing those kind of ref pressures, certainly in the way it's configured at my institution, to focus very specifically on a thing. What is your thing? I'm also interested in collaboration across departments. And this is something that we do very well at Dundee, which is largely a STEM-focused university. So there's lots of focus on the sciences broadly defined, particularly the life sciences, the biological sciences. And ways that we might think about those kind of collaborations, not only bringing in expertise that is with your own, but also forging a new type of expertise. And this is something that I see a lot of departments do very well around the UK in particular, thinking about Lancaster and all the great work they do within space and place, environmental humanities and the like. Exeter is another great example of that. I'm also quite interested in collaboration between universities, as much as anything else, and between partners, museums, galleries, author houses, and creative industries at large. And as I say, my main touchstone right now is the Dundee Comics creative space. And it's interesting to hear Emma talk about getting guest lectures in, and that's something that takes place a lot in the US, I've noticed. And I'm just really interested in the logistics of that, essentially bringing in expertise, and the limits of collaboration there. And are these live synchronous events, or are they pre-records? And I think it raises lots of questions about to whom does the expertise belong? Is that a collaboration? Is it sort of a deferred or displaced type of authority? It's kind of like a live action version of an article or book, and does that engage our students in a different, perhaps more meaningful way, getting them in touch with the humans that produce the scholarship that informs their own studies and their own scholarship moving forward. And logistically, who owns that material? I've been quite reluctant to bring in lecturers from outside, not least of all, because there's big question marks about who owns that material. Of course, it should belong to the lecturer, but my university is a bit fussy about those boundaries, if you like. And I'd love to hear more from others about whether that's an issue there. So let me tell you about my vantage point. Let me tell you about Dundee. So Dundee is a mid-size university in Scotland, in central Scotland. It has a 4-year undergraduate degree, which is the Scottish model is the basis of the American model, that 4-year liberal arts degree in many ways. And this is going to alarm everyone, but don't panic, because it's actually my idea and it's my strategy, and there is a plan. We are moving away from period survey teaching, and that means abolishing a module called Romantic to Victorian Literature. We're abolishing it, but we're replacing our sub-honours modules with 4 much more dynamic modules that include, in fact, prioritizes early modern and romantic literature. It's material that our students really respond to. So one example is a new sub-honours module, an early module that everyone takes, Literature and Society. The title is deliberately bland, but it's capacious. It allows us to talk about texts ranging from Dr. Faustus to Frankenstein. And there's a big priority big focus on authors such as Equiano, Mary Prince, Afroben, and so on. It allows us to do what people have been doing for a long time across the UK and across the world. That is to embrace authors that were once considered non-canonical, bizarrely, considering that in their own lifetime they were incredibly proficient and widely read authors. I'm thinking of Afroben in particular. It means that we can find different places to put the Shelleys and Keats and Byron and Austen and Hogg. We don't package them together anymore, but we sort of disperse them and use them as agents to kind of raise the flag for different romantic themes, and perhaps even neo-romantic themes if we think about later authors, and proto-romantic themes as well. It allows us to be much more dynamic. Within the auspices of literature and society, we can talk about social justice and inequality and embrace that and overcome those kind of themes in many ways. We've got lots of local partners that we can, and in some limited way, have liaised with, mainly Victorian period institutions. We've got the V&A Museum in Dundee, for example. There's the McManus, which is formerly the Victorian Albert Museum, for the V&A nicked the title, which has major holdings in Victorian studies, not romantic studies per se. At Dundee, we have the Thomas Campbell papers, things like that. We've got romantic period rare book editions of Shakespeare and Hazlitt and authors as diverse as that. But just slightly further afield, perhaps a bit too far in terms of field trips, as it were. We have access to the Burns House to the west. We've got Abbotsford, Scott's House to the south, Hospital Field to the north. We have the Hermitage in Dunkeld along the River Tay, which is the site of the Ossian myth and a major site of tourism for the Wordsworths. We might even think about Keats's many journeys across Scotland. And I'm interested in those kinds of field trips in a digital context, because, well, can we replicate those journeys in many ways, and therefore can we make them accessible to people from all over the world, Asia to America and so on, students who would not have ready access to the kind of sites that we have close proximity to. And again, that's an irony. These places are so close to us. We can take students to the Burns House, but we're not going to do that right now because of the pandemic. And what is meaningful about taking people to the Dunkeld, to take them to a place that Dorothy Wordsworth talked about? How, taking them there in person, how is that any different, better, worse, meaningful? How does it affect their understanding of the literature? If we can't do that online, think of all the enhanced tools that we have online, and that's perhaps something that Joe might talk about later, and maybe Stephen when he talks about digital books and rare books in a digital age, and so on. So here, again, I'm just raising questions and queries more than anything else. But as I say, these collaborations are right on our doorstep, and we're not really exploited them, but in a strange way, these are collaborations as it could still be, or it might be, and there's something better about that. And again, thinking more broadly about my teaching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, I'm not sure we'll ever go back to the large lecture hall lectures anymore. And Emma talked about this very well. This podcast, these sort of mini lectures, I'll be really honest, I was quite reluctant for a long time, because it felt gimmicky almost. It felt like, well, how can I push 50 minutes worth of material into 30 minutes? But then it occurred to me, belatedly, I'm ashamed to say, that you can have multiple podcasts, and the whole point is you can make it much more dynamic, just in the same way that we've passed out our romantic material across 4 early years modules, plus of course our honours modules are much more thematic now. And it's about making romanticism a teaching agent, not so much a teaching bubble, and raising themes in many ways. After all, romanticism and the study of romanticism is inherently collaborative. Think about the authors that we study, whether it's the Shelleys, for example, and the ways in which we teach romanticism, often team taught, the way we write and edit romanticism is inherently collaborative. Writing is incredibly visual, theatrical, and fundamentally auditory. The best way to to read Keats is to listen to Keats and hear the sibilants and so on. So in a strange way, the pandemic and in a digital age is kicking us back to perhaps slightly more conventional ways in which to read and study the Romantics. And again, for me, that's been a surprise. I think I was so invested, perhaps as many of you were, on this switch to online teaching and finding ways to take advantage of digital tools and the like. And I just want to end by saying, well, I've been kind of blindsided, and that's a good thing. And it's a good thing for people like me who sometimes need to shake up a little bit and embrace things. But then I'll end then by talking a little bit about Romantic Textualities, a journal that for whom I edit the series Teaching Romanticism. I want to end with this because I want to raise some problems that we've faced. I'll pop the link in the chat bar. I expanded the editorial team. It now includes Matthew Resnicek, Sarah Burdett at Warwick, Stephen Pallas in the US, and we now have expertise also from Francesca Saggini, and who gives us more input into drama. I wanted to expand the editorial board. This was a plan before the pandemic, because I wanted to map out the expertise, to lighten my load as well. Sometimes I feel I'm spread quite thinly, and I just want to make sure I'm reaching all of the corners of Romanticism. I'm very aware of my limitations. I'm not very well versed in Romantic period drama. I would love to know more, and speaking to people like Fran and Sarah, I learn much more about theatre. But if you look at that blog, you'll notice we haven't had a post for a while, because collectively we decided, with the pandemic going on, people are switching to online teaching and so on, we just simply cannot put pressure on deadlines. We have to be much more passive about it. So at a time when we might be more dynamic and have many more of these teaching blogs, and it's a very voluminous series, we've had multiple volumes, the challenge is very much one of concern for mental health and pressures and so on. Although I will end by saying, end on a positive note, we've got 4 or 5 fantastic volumes in the series lined up, and some really astute criticism from academic teachers across the world at all career levels. And as ever, I found that the best people to collaborate with tend to be junior colleagues, PhD students, early career scholars, because they're grappling with the kind of issues that students are themselves, and they've got such an informed approach. So I want to end by saying collaboration involves students themselves at all levels, and I want to find ways collectively that we can build in their expertise, reward that expertise, and build this larger platform for Romantic studies that embraces the whole world and all aspects of our wonderful period. Thanks for your time and attention.
Thanks very much, Dan. That was great, and I think really useful to think about how the sort of pandemic has challenged us getting to some of our usual spaces, but how that in some ways is quite a liberating thing, that we can access other spaces, and that it is easier to be open in some ways where you are working in a digital space than it is when you are being in a seminar room at a particular time. There's a kind of flexibility that's come with digital teaching that has, made you rethink what we actually do, and as you say, return to some quite traditional approaches. I have really enjoyed talking with students about literature, and sort of that the core aspect of what we do transfers online quite straightforwardly in some ways, that we can still have those conversations, but that those conversations can be connected up differently, can involve larger scale collaborations that would have been previously impossible due to spatiality and to people's time and to those sorts of things. So I mean my sense is that this is another thing with the event series that we were trying to do, that sort of rather than having a sort of Romanticism series in a particular place, in a particular location, which had been quite hard for bars to do in some ways without sort of picking some place that would have more access than others, by being able to be online, this series can encompass people all over the world who want to be included. And I think thinking about the ways that a whole series of other spaces have been opened up, and I hope will stay opened up when we're able to move back into our physical spaces, has been one of the real sort of positive things of the pandemic, although they've also been sort of series of challenges. They've been in some instances facilitative challenges. So thanks very much for that. And we'll pick up some of those points, I'm sure, in the questions. Our third speaker, Stephen Gregg, is going to talk a little bit about physical books in a time where accessing physical books is very complicated. So if I can invite Stephen to unmute, that would be great. Hey, Stephen.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Emma and Daniel, as well. I think what was really interesting about Emma and Dan's talks is, I mean, Emma called it muddling, but I think it's the sense we're experimenting too, and the limits, ostensible limits placed on our experience of teaching online. And I've been teaching, a lot of my stuff has been exclusively online as well as hybrid, has actually, in a sense, enabled us to rethink what learning can be. Now, teaching old books has always presented some challenges. Just to give you a bit of context, Busk University, a very small university, special collections of material before 20th century amounts to possibly 10, 12 books. Luckily, we have Bath Central Library, which over the centuries has amassed, because of very rich donors, some excellent rare books. And in the past, we've taken our students to examine and hold and pass around and share, smell those books, including very wonderfully, actually, a Nuremberg Chronicle. However, this year, things have changed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some practicalities, partly as a legacy of not having access to easy access to rare books, and how we teach old books. And to give you some context, I run a first-year course on print history. I run also a second-year course on literature and digital culture. And coming up next semester, not only is my first-year course coming up, but also a new MA module on the materialities of books. So how I'm going to be teaching these two modules next semester is very much on my mind. So I'm going to take you through some of the things I have been doing and some of the things I'm planning to do. And I guess really it's going to be about, Daniel came up with a wonderful single word about collaboration. I'm going to be thinking about students making stuff, I think, largely, because I think that might be a possible answer. So I'm just going to share some slides now. Okay, so book history without touching. I'm going to start with my experience about teaching books and teaching book history that relies upon digital resources. By the way, all the quotations on my slides are from the period which we're all interested in. Although it's a little outside of my expertise, but it's from they're from Stower's The Printer's Grammar from 1808. And really, I'm going to be starting by talking about how we can ask our students to read books when our access to books is limited to digital and remediated books. What you're looking at here is a book remediated by Echo. The interface we use, BASPAR, is the historical text platform.
Stephen, I think we're not seeing necessarily the same thing that you're seeing. We're seeing a sort of general view of your PowerPoint, but not the slideshow. Can you try starting the slideshow again?
Ooh, okay, yeah, we'll do.
How's that? That's way better. Thanks very much. We've got a careful.
Okay.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks very much.
Thank you for reminding me about that, Matthew. Okay. So really this is a kind of discussion I have. I'm going to be across all these modules that I run, because it's the nature of bookishness, really. What kind of book? How can we talk about books? What is the language of books when we don't have access to the physical book itself? And what happens to books when they are remediated. For the sharp-eyed amongst you looking at this screenshot of the historical text interface, and historical texts allows you to give you a side-by-side view of a single page remediated images. So the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice, first of all, that the page sizes are different. The even sharp-eyed amongst you might start to wonder why the title page is on the verso, on the left-hand side, which looks a bit unusual. And one of the things that we can do with our students, of course, is to get them to think about how these interfaces, how these databases are created and made. And we can do that by introducing them to kind of stages of remediation. We can remind them that perhaps what they're actually looking at is a version of a microfilm. And you can start to see why the book you'll see on historical texts presents a view of a book which actually doesn't exist at all. You'll see that actually the opening should like these. You're looking at the microfilms there. More broadly, of course, thinking about the bookishness of books, the losses perhaps, or the kind of differences we can apprehend through digital remediated books, is to think about different kinds of remediation, different kinds of digitization. To what extent? Same text, to what extent is this a book? What has happened to the bookishness of Defoe's An Essay on the Regulation of the Press? So I've found teaching this usually raises a lot of questions by students. They're not quite sure, but they generally ask the right kinds of questions. And I think that's the great place to start. We can fill them in with information about particular interfaces and about particular digital resources. But the questions they begin with about what's different about the book, what's missing. For example, this is black and white. There's no color on this. There's no bindings. What's about the cover or the dust jacket? Sometimes they think they expect a dust jacket there. What's happened to those things? So those are all the right questions. Further on, of course, we start going beyond just thinking about old books, but actually thinking about interfaces, about digitization processes themselves. And certainly in the literature and digital culture module, we get students to start looking around and poking around the about pages, the staff pages, the funding pages of various digital archives, some of which fare rather well in terms of their transparency, and some which students notice straight away are either opaque or just plainly obscure. So there's a couple of different kind of things going on there about our students' apprehension of old books, and it's bound up with a keen apprehension of digitization. But reading old books through digitizations also involves some knowledge of how old books are put together and who put them together. And one of my favorite quotations, and I can't remember who says this now, but authors don't write books. And I've always been really fascinated with these kinds of contentious statements. Authors don't write books. Of course, books are made. So taking that sense of bookishness to the next step. So I'm thinking again about students, how they can not just read about how books are made, but experience something of that ways in which we can trace a book and its print culture and its print history, the context of print. And one of the exercises we get our students to do is to create either a kind of a circuit. You can see there a little nice grab from Robert Darnton's communication circuit, focus on a particular figure of that circuit, looking at a particular book, finding out what they can. Another exercise we get students to do is to create a network, books, publishers, whose illustrated these books? What other books have been published by that same publisher? What other books might have been illustrated, to kind of create a kind of a 6 degrees of separation, if you like, of starting with one book. So there are two ways of kind of visualizing this, and this is really low tech stuff. I mean, one of the things I'm really keen on with any kind of digital teaching, or the teaching of the digital, is to use low tech stuff. I'm quite happy for students to use pen and paper to lay out their circuits or their networks, or just to use the kind of arrows and shapes available in any kind of standard word processing package. But the main thing here, it seems to me, is to visualize it, is to gather all this information, to collate all the information available in these wonderful resources. And I'm sure all of you can think of many more resources than I've listed here. But the sense that students can collate and gather information from across a variety of resources and lay it out and visualize it, I think this kind of making task and making of diagrams, I think, is another way of bringing home and vitalizing their kind of apprehension of something that might seem strange to them, that in fact authors don't make books. Who makes books? Shout out, by the way, to a particular resource there, the Women's Print History Project, which I think is fantastic. Heartily recommend it. It's one of the things we've been trying to do with teaching book history, is to bring on board feminist bibliography. And the Women's Print History Project has a database, but also some great case studies in their Spotlight series. Another way, of course, of bringing this home is to experience what it is to be a printer themselves. And again, a really low-tech exercise I get them to do. In fact, I do this for my first years in the very first week. And this is an exercise I set them. I give them, I write out a series of very long 18th century titles. You know how long they can be. They get shorter in your period. Okay, yeah, Emma. But it's a challenge to try and think about how that might be laid out. It brings home the artistry and labor involved with a simple thing like laying out a title page. They can also learn about typefaces and fonts as well. And printing that off, printing their designs off as well in the class is a great way of doing that. I'm not quite sure I'm going to do that, I think, when it's online only. I think what this is going to turn out to be is much more of a collaborative work online with them. Someone's going to be probably using a shared Google Doc. Shared Google Docs have been a bit of a godsend for us over here, where students can collaborate on the same document. Another exercise I set them, and this is an assessment, is a title page mashup, or what I call an imitation title assessment, where students imitate all the conventions of a title from the 17th and 18th centuries. My own title there, this is my go here. It's actually a play on Moxton's mechanical exercise, The Art of Printing. And I've basically found some individual letters which try to match the font from various bits of other documents from Ebo and Echo. Literally printed them out, cut them out, used paper and glue, took a photograph, and there it is. Again, really low tech, but again, get students to think about conventions and printing conventions. And they're also asked, of course, to explain their title page as well. And this kind of making, I think I'm going to really extend. This is one of the set texts, and one of the things, actually, I should say, my MA students are going to have to buy. It's the modern equivalent of the John Bull printing set. It uses rubber type, and it's about, I think it's about £14, so it's really quite affordable. And here's me messing around with that set. I don't think it's got enough ease, but it does. Again, it gives you some feel for the kind of precision required. And what you see there, they call them platons, those yellow strips, which is, I suppose, partly correct. It's the kind of thing that's going to press against the paper, but it's also partly composing stick, partly a form as well. So it's really interesting about how it's adapted these inventions of Gutenberg, really. And as you can see, I've made various mistakes there as well. I'm kind of looking forward to talking about students' mistakes in terms of over-inking, getting the pressure wrong. And in one sense, I picked up a B instead of a D, getting my P's and Q's mixed up. So yeah, all these great things they're going to experience by doing something hands-on at home, taking photographs and sharing with us online. And in that sense of getting them to do getting them to do stuff at home, I think is going to be really keen. I'm going to be sending them through the post some folding exercises. I won't send them this one. This is really basic. What I'll probably get them to do is to, I'll probably send them some stuff with a little bit of printing on, and they have to fold it and cut it up in the correct ways to make a mini book. And the other thing I think I'm probably going to show them and get them to do, and another shout out here to a great website, is this, again, more printing and folding and reading, making mini books. So really hoping the end of the MA program, they're going to be making their own little books. This is the Quarantine Public Library. I heartily recommend this. It's the work of some book artists from America, a lot of BIPOC artists, and I think one of the things you can actually print out and fold is a pamphlet on protesting in the wake of the George Floyd killings. So this is fantastic, and another way to kind of, I suppose, make the kind of connections that Emma and Dan were talking about in their talks too. I hope that's been interesting. I tried to keep time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. That's fascinating. Loads of really cool ideas. And yeah, particularly, I think I'm really impressed with your sort of devotion to the idea that despite the fact that we're operating so much digitally, that we can still include paper and ink in the sorts of things we do. That suggestion of the kit was a sort of wonderful idea about how people can do sort of things at home that they can sort of then show on screens, that sort of we don't, just because we are isolated from each other doesn't mean we have to lose all sense of the physicality of texts and of our modes of communication. So yeah, thanks for that. It was great. Okay, let's take our final talk now before we turn to questions. To remind you, if you would like to ask questions, please do feel free to type these in the chat with a Q in front of them. We'll pick some of those up after this final talk from the fabulous Jo Taylor. You're on mute at the moment, Jo, I think.
Thanks. That's why I have digital humanities in my job title, because I'm really good at the whole computer thing. Can you all see that okay? I'm going to assume yes.
No, it's good.
Thank you. I'm really excited, really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you all on this topic, which is one that's kind of close to my professional heart. I'm really happy to answer questions about how I've used this kind of stuff during COVID specifically, but I'm coming kind of from the opposite end of the scale, I guess, to Emma, in that I, by the nature of my job, have had to embed digital stuff in teaching as part of normal work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how my teaching and research have kind of inflected on each other in the way that I use technology in my teaching, with a particular focus on digital maps. So Matt said at the beginning that I am currently employed as a digital humanist. So at Manchester, I'm actually not hired to teach literature. I'm not even based in the literature department. I am hired to teach digital humanities, although I do also teach literature. So this semester I'm teaching Romanticism and Victorian module. But I'm formally based in the art history department. And that's an indication of the fact that management prefer to see digital humanities as being distinct from traditional subject research interests. So there's a kind of dichotomy for me, I guess, between the digital stuff I do and the literary stuff. That's meant that my job title is one that I'm not really very comfortable with, apart from the fact that it's ridiculous, but the digital humanist bit, because For me, digital humanities has always been about using digital tools creatively to augment humanities thinking, something where graphs, maps, or trees are in themselves treated like texts to be interpreted. So one of the points that Ian, Gregory, and I tried to hammer home in the book that's finally coming out next year is that those sorts of visualizations don't and kind of shouldn't provide answers. What they should do is to stimulate more questions. And that's the kind of main message, I guess, that I try and get my students to take from working with maps in ways that I'll talk about over the next few minutes. Notwithstanding my kind of skepticism about the discourse around digital humanities and digital methods in the UK Academy, they've been a really core part of how I work, both individually and more often collaboratively since my PhD, both in terms of research and teaching. So what I wanted to do was to just summarize a couple of key examples to indicate that relationship between DH research and literary teaching, particularly, as I say, in that attempt to impart to students the need to think as critically about the use of those technologies as they would about any of their reading. So digital humanities for me started with a messy scrap of paper. This is Sarah Coleridge's draft map of the fairyland in which she set her fairy tale novel Phantasmian. So this was the basis of one of my PhD chapters and an article. So this map, I think, was sketched in the early stages of writing Phantasmian, so sometime around 1835, 1836-ish. So some of the place names are amended on the map and then others are changed between the map and the final text. Sarah, around this time, wrote to a friend that writing a fairyland was really easy because she only needed to think about her childhood in the Lake District in order to create a convincing one. So my kind of question was, to what extent does this fairy tale's geography mimic the Lake District's? And what do those geographical similarities suggest about Sarah's literary relationship with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, with her father? So by flipping the map over so that it became a mirror image of itself, this is something that was suggested by a moment in the book, and overlaying it onto Google Earth, a Google Earth map of the lakes, I tried to suggest that the similarities in the two places' topographies was a deliberate effort on Sarah's part to engage with the canonical literary landscape in a kind of subversive way. So that whole process was really transformative for me because it completely changed the way I not only understood this text, but also the imaginative possibilities of literary geographical study. When I started working at Lancaster, which is Dan has mentioned, is just an ace place to work in terms of collaboration and crazy cross-disciplinary thinking. While I was there, I taught on an MA module called Place, Space, Text that was focused on the 19th century. And I wanted to give students a similar opportunity to think outside the box, to read the text that they were studying in new ways, but also to try and get them to read creatively in ways that were outside of that sense of pressure of doing well in an essay, by giving them something that I knew that none of them had ever done before, so they couldn't feel the same kind of anxiety about, I guess. So using some poems by John Clare, I ran a workshop with them that taught them how to translate literary works into something mappable. And then their formative assessment asked them to produce a map of any 19th century work and then present it to the rest of the class. So I did that for 2 years and I'm still talking about it because I was completely blown away by what the students did with it. So this remains my absolute favourite. This was one by Rebecca Busk, who's now completing a PhD at Lancaster. She's actually talking at one of the BARS events in the new year. And I think this is just such a remarkable example of the kind of work that curious and critical and enthusiastic thinkers can do with even pretty straightforward digital technologies. This is literally just Google Maps, the kind that most of us have, you know, on our phones and use loads. So what this map offers is a visualization based on Shelley's lines written above the Eugenean hills. The markers that you can see there, the orange and yellow ones, their locations mentioned in the poem. The purple box outlines the distance that Shelley claims to be able to see, and the orange box is an approximation of what you can actually see from the Eugenean hills, which Rebecca worked out manually using some very clever maths. So you can produce this kind of viewshed automatically in a geographical information system, in a GIS, but they've been really severely underused in literary studies. So as far as I know, Rebecca's was the first instance of somebody using a viewshed in this way. And then Ian and I based the last chapter of the book on a similar theory, inspired in large part by Reb's work. But what was really amazing about this exercise was the analysis that this map underpinned. So using historical map data taken, I think, from the National Library of Scotland's database, Rebecca teased out the political implications of the sightlines that Shelley claims throughout the poem and compared them to the ways that national borders were changing during the latter stages of the Napoleonic Wars. There's a blog post somewhere that I'll dig out and put in the chat if it's still up. It was honestly just like exceptional work. So work from students like this was a huge inspiration for writing the book with Ian, which was the basis of my postdoc work at Lancaster. It was just the thing that I was writing while I was teaching this module. So that book focused more specifically on GIS. So it focused on a corpus of writing about the Lake District. So a collection of 80 texts, mostly from the long 19th century. And it combined methods from GIS and corpus linguistics with literary studies to demonstrate the ways in which digital humanities methods could generate new questions, new forms of reading, and not just provide answers. So this map is a representation of every place name that's mentioned in that corpus. And in the book, what we try and do is demonstrate how we can analyze the relationship between certain terms and place names to develop new understandings of geography and place writing throughout the 19th century Lake District. So for example, this one, this is a density smoothed map that represents a geography of lakeland walking in the Romantic period. So from this kind of map, we could ask questions like, where do writers walk, or where do they talk about walking? What literary footsteps are they following? And what's significant about the way they talk about walking? So spoiler, the pro-Wordsworthians all wander around the Lake District, and the anti-Wordsworthians use any other term they can think of. So this semester, obviously, we can't go to the Lake District. So on our Romantics and Victorian module, I've asked students to visit the Lake District vicariously, at least, by looking at Google Earth, finding a Wordsworthian site that's mentioned in one of the texts that we're studying, and locating a photo of it on Geograph, which is for geographically located photos is an amazing resource. And I asked them to work with those two images alongside the poem, or an extract of the poem, to think about the ways that switching between close and distant perspectives can change the ways that we read, but also to think about how we might situate a poem in the landscape. It's that last kind of theme that the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is kind of building on. So this is a kind of cheat, because it's a thing I haven't done yet, but this is the module that I'm running next semester. Who knows whether or not it'll be online. We've been entirely online this semester. At the moment, they're saying that we'll be lecturing online and giving seminars face-to-face, but I guess Manchester's going to have to come out of lockdown first. So that research alongside, so my job requires that I teach some kind of technical skill as part of the modules that I put together. So this will be my special subject, and to fulfill the requirements of the job, I had to teach some kind of techie thing. So in this module, we'll journey around the literary histories of some of Britain's national parks. So we're going to the Lake District, the Peak District, the Yorkshire Dales, and Exmoor. As we move through them, what we'll be doing is asking what the cultural and social and environmental implications are of maintaining these places as literary landscapes. So I'll be training them up in mapping technologies like Google Maps through to GIS, but mostly for the purpose of teaching them how to combine literary data with environmental, ecological, or meteorological data to see how that kind of cross-disciplinary approach both changes our interpretations of the text and makes their literary scholarship more evidently, more directly applicable to real world challenges. I think, as Emma and Dan and Stephen have all said, my students this semester have been most enthusiastic, really, when the conversation has turned to the ways that the stuff that we're reading matters for the lives that we're living at the moment. So this has been a whistle-stop tour. Thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'll, if somebody could remind me what links I furiously promised I'd share with you, I'll put them in the chat.
Thanks so much. It's great. Oh, okay. Weird echoes of myself coming through your microphone, but hopefully that will stop. Okay, no, Zoom has worked out what's going on now. Thanks very much. That was wonderful. We've been putting some links in the chat as we've been going through, so you may find some of them there already. But yeah, that's a really fascinating sort of exploration of your sort of own journey into digital humanities, and how that's been a journey taken along with students, and which students have sort of fed into in all sorts of ways. I think the point about sort of teaching as collaboration, both with sort of students and within institutional frameworks and across worlds and research clusters and these sorts of things, has been something that's come out really strongly out from all of the talks today. And I think perhaps on something that was there before but has really been highlighted by the digital sort of move that we've mostly had to make, is the sort of, when we teach, we don't teach alone in a seminar room with our students. Our students are there, so we are never alone, just pontificating to them. We should never be. But also we're parts of these larger intellectual networks and larger communities of all sorts of kinds. So can I invite our other panelists also to reappear, to apparate back into the room by unmuting their cameras, or muting is the right word for cameras? Probably not. Dan, you're really above and beyond with your backgrounds this time. And can I invite people to, if anyone else would like to appear on camera, do feel free. It would be nice to move more towards a discussion if people would like to. I have a couple of questions saved up that we could begin with, but if people have questions or comments or thoughts, would like to talk about an aspect of their own teaching in this difficult period, or more generally, it'd be brilliant to have any comments or thoughts. I'll take, I guess, Joe's question from right back at the beginning of Emma's paper first and put that to the other people, but do really do come in with questions. We would like this to be as much a conversation as it can be in this environment. So Joe, I think you asked during Emma's paper about the problems sort of student burnout and perhaps student vulnerability during the pandemic, which has been something that I've been very aware of. I was sort of early on trying to work out whether it was polite to try and insist that all students have cameras on, and I decided against that in the end, because I know some of them just really aren't in a state where they want to be constantly observed through those technologies. I got very sort of blasé about sort of these cameras on, cameras off, however you feel comfortable coming, just try and come if you can. But I don't know whether Emma or Stephen or Dan have some thoughts about that sort of taking care of our students during this pandemic.
Being comfortable is the best thing. Like, students need to feel comfortable. Like, I really am against the crowd who feel cameras on, mics on, this is important. I mean, there are elements of that. We've had conversations on a working level. I know that others believe that it's quite it's something about vocational skill that they're perhaps missing out on, that element of kind of conversation. But I think that we're learning that in different ways in terms of chat, etc., and seeing the benefits of them feeling comfortable over something digital. I'd much prefer them to feel comfortable. But I think just the most important thing that I've realized as a teacher is obviously be professional, but be yourself as well. You know, there's this whole kind of spirit of we're muddling through this together. And there's some days where, you know, my heating's rubbish in here and I've got my hoodie on and I'm like to my students, I'm very cold. It's just being yourself and just being relatable, being able to, so students can see that you're just human as well, I think has been one of the main things.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. One of the things that I've, like, just building on that, if I may, on the comfort thing, is to give my students were already struggling with the reading because, as I said in the chat, anyone who's seen news will have seen how difficult Manchester students have had it this term. And it's really badly affected them. So a lot of them have not been able to get through the reading. So we've had really, really specific reading, so that even if they've not been able to read the text, the whole text, they know exactly what passages we're going to be talking about, and so they can just come along and chat about that, and it doesn't matter then if they've not done the reading.
I think one of the challenges of online teaching is this movement away from a space in which has a long legacy of knowing how power, how authority, and how voicing ideas work, like the seminar. It is a space which is in a university. You go to university, you park, you walk, you ride the buses, you take your books in and sit down. What's new about online teaching is that we're all in each other's homes and places where we live. They're not workspaces for most of us. That at once is both intimidating, I think, for us as well as our students, yet also quite intimate and enabling and intimate in some ways that I think Emma was just talking about then. And it is a kind of very different set of dynamics that are going on in online teaching, which is, I think, genuinely unsettling, possibly enabling. And also that importance, therefore, of making everyone feel, I was going to say at home, which is a really interesting phrase to use, but I guess that's at home in a way that's still going to be a learning space, and I think that's the challenge we're all trying to muddle through, and you know, it's useful to remind that we are muddling through together, and I think when we bridge that gap with our students in this very strange space of the screen, you know, that's the only space we're inhabiting. It's not going to be easy.
Yeah, absolutely right. I always say to my students, keep your video cameras off when we're all together, if there's, say, 25 of us together. But I use the breakout function very often, and then they do turn the cameras on, and they're with their peers. And that's been a great tool. That's not only replicating, but actually surpassing the old model of teaching I used to use in the classroom, where they would break off into smaller groups, but you can still overhear each other. They have actual privacy with their peers and so on. One tip that I picked up from my languages colleagues is to invite students, if they're comfortable and if the technology is up to it, to keep the microphones on, because that psychologically you're much more engaged. So cameras off and microphones on, you're more attentive, as it were, rather than going around putting your music on and all that kind of stuff. Fundamentally, we just have to trust each other. You know, there's that mutual respect, but also trust and so on. And yeah, I mean, Steve put it really well. There is the sense that it's not a home space, it's a workspace, and vice versa, and it's kind of commingled up. And how do you draw the line? It's a tricky one, and it has to be student focused, as Emma says. Everyone has to be comfortable. And what I say to students is have an avatar, have an image, and that's great, and they can recycle it and they can have fun with it, have alter egos. So this week I'm going to be Afroben, this week I'm going to be Defoe, you know, have these images, and, you know, we have a lot of fun with it, and that's a great way to get into it, you know.
I think I really like Stephen's point about the sort of institutionalized space of the seminar, which is in some ways comfortable, but also does have that very particular pattern of authority. So feedback to the chat has sort of raised the point about whether digital teaching allows a more intimate connection. I guess one of the sort of slightly uncomfortable things is it almost requires it, where people can see spaces. But I think what you've been saying about leaning into that, I would not normally be drinking tea in all of my seminars, which I've inevitably been doing for long seminars. I have said, let's take 5 minutes, I need some more tea. And allow people to get away from the computer, walk around a bit, stretch their legs, and sort of make themselves feel like that their home spaces are not sort of so intruded upon by the authority of the seminar room, but that it does allow for those sorts of things. And yes, there was some, I think I've been really enjoying seeing people's pets appear in frames. It's sort of, yeah, it's always a little bit about sort of how much to sort of lean into that, because you don't want to make people feel uncomfortable about the fact that they may well be in their bedrooms by drawing too much attention to that. It's something we have to be quite sensitive about. But I think that intimate connection is sort of there, whether we want it to be or not in some ways. But I think dealt with sensitively. I have had some really lovely experiences teaching this semester from around the sort of little accidents of Zoom and these sorts of things. There's a point that Anthony raised a little bit earlier about whether there are things that people have felt they've just not been able to do while we've been digital. Have any of you sort of felt really blocked from doing something you really wanted to do, not being in a physical space? And have you got around that, perhaps?
So I've been much more conservative with my teaching than I normally would have been. I mean, I've had to be a lot more directed as well, which I think is probably a good thing for me. I tend to like a seminar where I'm like, guys, what are your thoughts? And I think that having to think much more specifically about what we're going to do has been helpful. But I experimented with things like Hypothesis, it's just a social annotation tool, earlier in the semester, which was ace. I really liked it, and the students that engaged with it really got on with it. But I think particularly over the course of the semester, as the students have just got tireder and tireder and tireder, it's been harder and harder and harder to get them. And I don't mean this as a criticism of the students at all. I think they're doing as much as they can, but doing anything extra, like they're surviving on the bare minimum, like they're doing the reading that they can and watching the lectures that they can, but extra activities and the reading groups and things that we've been putting on, they just don't have the capacity. So actually increasingly over the course of the semester, it's just been a case of retreating back to familiar strategies so that it's one less thing for them to worry about.
I rely a lot on film adaptations for what I teach. I'm really interested in adaptations and often put on film screenings. I do miss the big screen, the big lecture theatre and so on. But interestingly, when we use Boxer broadcasts and we watch them on our computers and they watch them on their computers, and we've got the chat function, so we can comment on the film as we're watching it. So it isn't simply us watching a film adaptation. Isn't that interesting? Now let's come back to the novel, whatever it might be. It's a bit more dynamic, but I do miss the lovely big screens, big lecture theatre, bit of popcorn, all that kind of stuff. Maybe we'll be back to that one day.
Basically, it's just accessibility. So a mixture of mainly kind of secondary criticism and students being able to use the full extent of the library facilities. So trying to just in a very traditional way, but also in terms of field trips as well. We usually do, I'd love to have done a trip to the Brontes Parsonage Museum, to 7 Stories over in Newcastle. That's what Andy usually does with his groups. And it's just, I suppose, making do with, we're having someone, for example, we're having a guest lecture from 7 Stories where they're going to pre-record the lecture in the archives and show some stuff which they have in the archives and pre-record that. So it's not the same though as the students handling this kind of material. So I guess it's just, accessibility really.
Ian, did you have anything on that, or are you,
Sorry, yes. Well, the obvious thing missing is handling books for me. We can't swap them around. We can't touch them. So, I mean, I think the question of what's happening online is really important. I think that sense that that Joe was saying that students are getting tired. It's really tiring. I find online teaching is tiring. Actually, hybrid teaching, when you've got a synchronous in person and online, is exhausting. It's just, I've never been so tired in my life of trying to teach that way. And I think what we very quickly adapted in our department was to kind of try and make sure students are doing different things fairly constantly, lots of breaks, but also to make sure that the actual scope of the actual seminar is smaller. We're actually going to cover fewer things, but and just go with that. And I think to accept that the exhaustion that comes with long periods of online engagement, and have to kind of mitigate that in some ways. So yeah, I think what Joe was saying about her students being tired, it's I'm sure, yeah, this is felt by everyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely true. Leith in the chat is talking about usually including ballad singing in lectures, but the idea being able to do collaborative singing has that same problem with online applause, where once a certain number of inputs come into Zoom, it starts cutting some of them out. So applause always sounds really attenuated. Presumably music singing would just be a couple of voices. So I guess there are things that we will all look forward to doing once we're back in rooms. But there's a question for Eleanor that was directed to Dan, but I think it's a really good final question to end on. So what do you think the pandemic has changed about how you'll teach? Has this opened up some new prospects, new things that you would hope to be able to carry forward into our teaching once we have the affordances of physical space again? So how has this perhaps been facilitative or allowed for some changes in practice?
Pen and paper exercises.
Yeah, Steve's exactly right. In a weird way, it has made me think a lot more about older technologies and using things like pen and paper, because we can't use it currently in ways. It's made me quite nostalgic, and I think it's a constructive form of nostalgia, where we can think, oh, actually, let's rethink about some things. I think we were so much, certainly speaking about my own department, we were just so focused on lining up latest legislation. So there's lots of legislation now about making all lectures accessible in terms of subtitles, things like that. We were so focused on the technology, we kind of forgot about or were less attentive to just the variety of methods we have for teaching. And some of that's been taken away temporarily. Thinking about that again is really exciting. I think we're so used to the idea that we have to progress, move forward, embrace all of the technologies, go digital, but sometimes digital tools cannot quite do what we do in person. For example, I'm quite keen to take students on various, Keats's Walk, go to the Burns College and things like that. But I'm not sure we'll suddenly do that. We'll have to do something else. So for me, it's been kind of a great exercise in rethinking pedagogy in theory and, more importantly, in practice. Yeah, nothing more to say really. Yeah, challenging, but kind of constructively so, in a strange way. That's an odd thing to say in a pandemic when people are losing their lives and livelihoods, but it's a kick up the bum that I need, and perhaps many of us need.
I think I'd 100% try and keep some blended aspects. Like I was speaking about, I know there's a couple of questions as well about guest speakers, but the format of inviting a guest lecturer to do something pre-recorded or something, basically what we do is we line up our seminar series and teaching weeks to interact with one another, and then get speakers to kind of think about how they'd interact with a second year undergraduate level, but also public audience as well. And I like the kind of digital aspect of that. I like the fact that we can do extra events where it can make it accessible for everybody. And that's what I like about this, that it's something, I like the fact that a lot of students at Edge Hill have other responsibilities. They've got jobs, they may be mature learners, they may have problems with accessibility. And that kind of element of my teaching and inviting kind of guest speakers, etc., so everybody can get involved, I think is something that's made me realize that this can be a really good thing. So I'd like to kind of keep it blended if I can.
Short and snappy lectures for me, and keeping the lectures online. I miss the seminar teaching, but short and snappy YouTube videos I'm all there for.
Yeah, and I think sort of the ability to sort of share and make those resources available, that sort of, I think again it goes back to a little bit to Stephen's point about authority, that the lecture, the sort of the space in which one person who has authority stands at the front and speaks to a group for 50 minutes, an hour, sort of thinking about breaking that up a bit, about maybe we don't need that much time or don't need to fill that time in quite the same way. The
strange effect actually of doing pre-recorded lectures, which by the way students absolutely love, especially if they've got the captioning as well, which is great for accessibility, of course. But the strange thing is that actually looking back over your captions, it slightly decenters one's authority, that position at the front, and you're suddenly having to defend or even carefully edit what you've just said, just because sometimes it's completely rubbish, especially if you're like me and you try to do lectures in one take.
My worst experience this semester has been getting that one take that I thought was really good and then playing it back and it sounded like I was under the sea. I had to record it many more times to try and get a take that was good again. I will not miss that, but I will miss some of the other aspects I think are really good. And I think that, yeah, that decentering of authority, there's something nice about being in a room. And I do like in some ways the investment that people have in lecture. You've all chosen to be in this space for this time to think about this thing, but it is nice to be able to weave in certain kinds teaching, sort of listening to things in the background and have sort of things on while you're cooking or being in other sorts of spaces. And I think thinking about that and demanding sort of less tyrannously that our students are in a particular space, or thinking really about what we're asking of them when they do that, is a really powerful thing. We've got lots of really great points in the chat. There's a lovely point that's just come. And we love the students said we love the recorded lectures. It means we can just fast forward through the boring bits. Well, that is sort of one of the problems potentially. The bit that they think is boring might be really important, but it also makes us think about, are there bits where we could cut or we could edit or we could make it clearer why all of this is of interest.
But just on that point again, because it's something that surprised me, but if I'm really honest with myself, the last 3 or 4 years, giving the best lectures I possibly can, there's always a sense you look up in the back row, they might be texting or they're taking notes or they're chatting and so on. In a sense, if students are watching these online lectures on their own terms, you know, they've got jobs and they've got commitments, even if they speed it up, the fact that they're taking ownership over the material, I think is really exciting. If they're speeding it up because they want to skip over the boring bits, great. It makes the overall quality of the lecture better. And so I think that's, yeah, I'm all for that. It's better than forcing them to sit in a lecture hall for an hour if they're just not engaged by it. So, yeah. It's complicated, isn't it?
It is, but I think your point about collaboration really stands. I'm aware that I've indulged one of my own worst teaching habits in pandemic conditions. I've overrun us slightly. So can I just ask if anyone has final thoughts, but then we'll wrap up and let people get to their dinners or to their other evening activities.
I'd like to kind of just echo Anthony's comment there in the text about the dangers of students becoming disengaged from the social aspects of learning, and I think that's something we are struggling with, absolutely, and I don't know what the answer is, not right now anyway.
But I think when they receive their printing kits, that will be something that will sort of bring them back into the sort of thing. I think it is a problem. It's a problem for all of us, that we're drained of attention during the current period. I'm finding sustained focus a lot more difficult than I usually do, he says, possibly deluding himself, but that's what I'm blaming it on, at least. But yeah, I think the sort of points that people have been making about collaboration, about varying things, about making sure, give focused guidance, about reconnecting us with physicality and place in the forms that they're available to us in the digital. There've been some really wonderful suggestions that you've all made in your talks about how we can get through this together with our students and how we might improve our teaching as we move forward and hopefully out of pandemic conditions. So thank you all so much for your contributions.